Welcome to this week's podcast, Business Success in a Virtual World. I'm Tim Beharon, Chairman of Creative Strategies, and with me today is my colleague, Barton Goldenberg, President of ISM Guide, who has written 3 books on CRM, one of the leading authorities on that subject, as well as business processes. And together we have created we think a good resource site for those who are interested in the metaverse and virtual worlds in the context of business. It's called the Metaverse Resource Center. And the website is ismguide.com/metaverse-resource-center. If you actually just put in ismguide.com, it comes up because it's part of Barton's opening slide. And it shows the center when you can just hit and go right to it. Each week, our goal is to share with you what's kind of going on in the world of virtual worlds today in the enterprise. We're not looking at, in essence, what you really can do long-term, as opposed to what you can do based on what's already being done. There's no question there's all kind of content out there trying to give you advice on, here's what you should do and here's how the things should be done. And that's vital. But our particular purpose of this podcast is to lay out what people are actually doing today. Our website, for example, has over 130, 140 actual case studies of people using technology, AR, VR, and XR for enterprise apps today. It's amazing to me when you look at the case studies that are on the site, how much is already being done. And yet there's a lot of questions on the importance, not only in the definition of the metaverse, but how it's going to affect enterprise. And here these people are already doing it. Each week when we do our podcasts, we try to put in place and share with you one strategic example of a company who's already doing this. And so Barton does a really good job at crystallizing and taking a good look at these particular website things that we post, and is going to share with you today basically the case study of what JP Morgan is doing in the metaverse. Barton?
Thank you, Tim. So JP Morgan is a very interesting company. It's actually JP Morgan Chase and Company. And as many of you know, it's an American multinational financial services company that's headquartered in New York City. It has $3.67 trillion in total assets and operations worldwide. So this is a very large financial institution. The history is also interesting. It traces back its roots to New York City more than 200 years ago. And along the way, they've picked up firms that include JP Morgan, the Chase Manhattan Bank, Bank One, Manufacturers Hanover Trust, Chemical Bank, the First Bank of Chicago, and several other well-known brands. So it's quite an interesting amalgamation of different financial institutions along the way. Today, JP Morgan Chase is a leader in investment banking, financial services for both consumer and small businesses, also commercial banking, financial transaction processing, and asset management. JP Morgan Chase is the largest U.S. bank by total assets and the 5th largest bank worldwide by total assets. In 2022, JP Morgan Chase market cap reached $393 billion US dollars, and it has more than 270 employees globally. Now, here's something that stood out when I was learning more
Barton,
about.
I think that was at 270,000, not 270.
270,000
yeah.
employees globally. But what stood out to me is the annual technology budget of JP Morgan Chase. It's a whopping $12 billion in 2022, which I find an astonishing commitment. JP Morgan Chase is one of those mega banks that's betting on innovative technology, ranging from robotic processing automation, open-edge blockchain systems, all the way to the metaverse, and that these technologies can help them slash costs over long term, but also, very importantly, enhance both customer experience and customer engagement. So, Tim, let me now share with you more details about JP Morgan's entry into the metaverse. Now, JP Morgan is actually the investment banking arm of JP Morgan Chase. And in 2022, JP Morgan made two important announcements. The first announcement took place in the beginning of the year in February, when JP Morgan became the first bank to enter the metaverse in the ways that I'm going to be talking about, opening a lounge in the popular blockchain-based metaverse called Decentraland. The move represented JP Morgan's bet on the benefits of establishing an early presence in the metaverse. And I'll talk about that lounge that they opened in just a moment. The second announcement was the Metaverse study that was released by JP Morgan's Onyx Blockchain Financial Operations. And it details why JP Morgan is getting into the metaverse, including the huge business potential. The study, which I would strongly recommend you look at if you're in the financial services industry, is called Opportunities in the Metaverse: How Businesses Can Explore the Metaverse and Navigate the Hype versus the Reality. And what it says is that the metaverse will likely infiltrate every sector in some way in coming years, and the market opportunity is estimated to be greater than $1 trillion in annual income. And just I did a little more deeper research, of which 60 billion comes from socializing, 54 billion comes from transactions buying and selling virtual goods, 41 billion comes from the ownership of NFTs. Yes, they're not quite dead yet. Virtual real estate and other, as well as 80 million being paid to creators. So it's a huge opportunity in the eyes of JP Morgan. Now back to the lounge. JP Morgan calls their lounge in the metaverse the Onyx Lounge. It's located in Mataiku, a virtual version of Tokyo's Harajuku shopping district. And when you visit the ground floor of the Onyx Lounge, your avatar can see a roaming tiger, I'm amusing, view a wall touting JP Morgan's blockchain accomplishments, watch videos of financial forums that JP Morgan has participated in, and you also see this kind of cool picture of portrait of JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon, very well known, and that picture morphs into the image of Christine Moy, who's the head of their crypto unit, and then she invites you to visit the second floor of the lounge. And on the second floor, your avatar can then check out what experts are saying about the crypto market. You can learn about the Onyx services that are offered by JP Morgan, and you can pick up literature from nearby conference tables about these services. Now, it's not exactly a hangout in the true sense of the word, but I think it's really a good illustration of what life in the metaverse could be like, or can be like, at least in the financial services industry. JP Morgan built this lounge to be able to offer institutions and businesses, meaning their customers, an opportunity to enter the metaverse. While the JP Morgan study, metaverse study, makes it clear they don't believe that the metaverse will take over all human interactions, JP Morgan is keen to explore the many exciting opportunities it presents for customers and brands in the spirit of a pioneer that takes risk, and they feel that it's better to take that risk now than to be left behind later on. So here's the two large areas that JP Morgan is currently eyeing in the metaverse. The first is virtual real estate ownership. Now, while you can still buy a plot of land in the metaverse today for, roughly speaking, 10 grand, in 2021, the average price of a parcel of virtual land more than doubled, jumping from $6,000 in June of 2021 to $12,000 by the end of the year. That's just as an example of how crazy the market can be. That very same year, the plot of land next to rapper Snoop Dogg's virtual real estate in the metaverse sold for a whopping $450,000. Forecasts call for today's $500 million digital property market, with Sandbox Metaverse accounting for $350 million of that total, and Decentraland Metaverse accounting for another $110 million of that total. They see this $500 million digital property market growing tenfold and becoming a $5 billion market by 2026. This is an enormous growth. JP Morgan believes the virtual real estate market in the metaverse could eventually start offering services much like the physical world that JP Morgan currently works in, and that includes credits, that includes mortgages, that includes rental agreements, which are all JP Morgan strongholds. The second area that JP Morgan is eyeing is virtual gaming, which, while not new, is a new twist, as you'll see in a moment, for JP Morgan. Because this landscape has its own population, it has an in-game currency, digital assets, and one that actually parallels an existing global economy. And JP Morgan believes that virtual gaming presents an opportunity for the bank to play a significant role, given its long-standing core competencies in cross-border payments, in foreign exchange, in financial asset creation, as well as in trading and safekeeping of assets. In summary, JP Morgan entered the metaverse, and it put them in an advantageous position to profit from what is often referred to as first mover advantage, as well as establish the JP Morgan brand in the metaverse as the bank of choice. JP Morgan sees the key bank opportunity as creating a flexible financial services ecosystem or platform that allows consumers to seamlessly move from the physical to the virtual world, provide easy, frictionless, and personalized experiences across e-commerce, payment options, and wealth management. It's a tremendous story. Now, one of the more important points as I was learning more and more about this is the participation of JP Morgan rivals as they are actively pursuing the metaverse. So JP Morgan, I mentioned, is the first major bank to really claim a stake in the metaverse with the launch of their Onyx Lounge. But it's not the first to acknowledge this trillion-dollar potential opportunity in the virtual space. For example, rival investment firm Goldman Sachs, again a great firm, recently predicted that the metaverse offers not a $1 trillion, but an $8 trillion market opportunity globally. And the large rival investment firm Morgan Stanley has decided it wants to really focus on China, where they predict the metaverse initial addressable market will be around $4 trillion and then grow to $8 trillion as the metaverse starts disrupting offline activities, including test driving and real estate showing and education and virtual land purchasing and much more. Most digital banks, and this includes just like all digital banks, an example would be Quonic in New York. They're actively establishing their outposts in the metaverse today. And it's not to suggest that several other banks haven't been active in the area of metaverse. They include Bank of America, which has had a virtual reality training program for a number of years, BNP Paribas, which is a French bank. They've had a virtual reality app that allows customers to access account activity and transactions in a VR environment. PNC advisory services for clients to buy virtual land in the metaverse. But I think what JP Morgan has done is really gone all in a very big way with a huge financial commitment to really become the metaverse bank of choice. And while the exact path forward for JP Morgan and its rivals may not be completely clear either to JP Morgan or the financial services industry at this time, what is certain is the enormous amount of innovation that's going on within the financial services industry as it targets the metaverse as a huge future business opportunity. You know, I sat back on my daily bike ride, Tim, and I thought, imagine the day when the metaverse becomes the front end, and that what you now do, so that front end that allows investors to see their portfolios, et cetera, in a 3D environment, but also then leverages generative AI insight into that view from the back office. So metaverse front office, generative AI back office, where the investor can come in and make all kinds of queries and decisions. When you're a true pioneer, which I consider JP Morgan to be, your focus tends to be long-term, even if the impact may not be immediately recognizable. Which is why I encourage, and I think you do the same, Tim, every financial institution, not only to have a metaverse strategy today, but to begin to implement that strategy immediately if you're not already underway. Needless to say, Tim and I would be delighted to assist financial firms at every step of the way to ensure their successful entry into the metaverse. And as Tim alluded to learn more about financial industry metaverse case studies, I strongly recommend that listeners visit the ISM, and it's an award-winning Metaverse Resource Center. We just got a very big award. Tim gave you the URL, ismguide.com/metaverse-resource-center, where in addition to hundreds of metaverse use cases, in fact, Tim, we're now up to about 172, and 168 articles and 40 videos, you can now download the new ISM 8 Steps to Doing Business Successful in the Metaverse white paper, and where you can also learn about and sign up for the complimentary ISM 2-hour Metaverse Bootcamp, which is targeted to companies, executives, teams. Back to you, Tim.
Barton, as I listen to that case study, there's a few things that kind of come to mind. First of all, that issue of being first mover. How important is that, not only for the financial industry, but I think for any industry at this stage?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Tim, you sit in Silicon Valley, and I need not tell you, you know probably the answer to this question even better than I do. Let's look at who was first, the importance of, for example, Google in the search engine industry and the role that they play today in that very industry. Or look at any of the large organizations in Silicon Valley that were first in the market. Now, again, not all the time do they sustain that advantage, but very often if they continue to get good funding, they can establish themselves, and while everybody's catching up, they're using that venture capital or investment money to take one step, to make one step forward. So you think of, just to use today's example, you have generative AI, you have OpenAI that comes out with their GPT chat 3 and 4 or whatever may be coming. So now you have Microsoft catching up with Bing, and you have Google catching up with Bard. But while this is happening, OpenAI is moving on to their GPT chat 5 and so forth. So it's a very, very important to have first mover advantage. And I think that JP Morgan knew that, and that's why they were willing to spend a good deal of money to maintain and secure that position.
You made one other observation from your bike ride that I think is really fascinating, where the front end, you go in using the metaverse, and then the AI, ChatGPT and others, are to sit there on the back end to help them do the analysis. That would be an amazing combination. And I assume that the JP Morgan and all the bank guys are already trying to figure out how they're going to use AI as a part of not only how they sell their products, but helping their customers make more money. But boy, that would be a really powerful connection.
Well, I'm glad you picked up on that, because I actually agree with you. And here's the thought. A lot of people still are mystified. What is the metaverse? How do I use it? All kinds of questions. But again, we encourage you to go to the Metaverse Resource Center and look at hundreds of companies that are profiting from the metaverse today. But more importantly, for those that really aren't totally comfortable with the metaverse, for me anyhow, and Tim may disagree, it's the 3D component, that you're doing everything in 3D, that really differentiates it from today's 2D, other computer platforms. So if you think about the metaverse as a front end, as that very nice 3D entry into, in this case, the metaverse financial world, then what happens is you can pull up your analysis, your portfolios, and various financial tools and instruments. But then you can start, as you said, to query and analyze. Now, the metaverse is not an AI engine. That's not what it's meant to be. So then you would then tap into, in the back end of the metaverse, inside the metaverse, if you will, that engine, that AI engine or engines, that would then give you deep insight into various options and what's happening in the market. So now you're viewing all of this through your 3D device as you're coming through the metaverse on the front end, and you have the power of AI in the back end. And I think it's going to happen, and I think it's a killer opportunity.
I do too. And again, I'm fascinated, number one, that JP Morgan even in the earliest cycle, decided they were going to start putting money into this thing, and they've made significant progress. I do want to ask a little bit about the timing, in the sense that if you go to Decentraland and others, even though there is a VR connection, most of those and Roblox and others are still in a 2D structure. You're actually accessing them. And I would assume that the JP Morgan biggest part of what they're doing in Decentraland is still focused on more of a interaction coming through a PC or a tablet or something, as opposed to the headsets yet, because the headsets are still relatively new and we don't really have what I would call critical mass to move it in that direction. Now, having said that, I think that may change, especially if Apple should do something this year in AR. I think that the conversation on hardware supporting this may change. But even if it doesn't, these guys are going ahead full speed, committing to the R&D and the creation of these type of solutions for their customers, regardless. And that to me strikes an important perspective, in the sense that no matter what industry you are in, I think that being proactive, even now, is critical. I do want to bring up another point, Barton, that you and I use in the boot camps, which is, to me, I think one of the most important things that we bring up in these lectures that we do. But the idea of a champion, of an individual who not only is tasked with the role, but actually understands it to the point where they can champion it. Can you, because you do that really well when you explain that.
Yeah, I can't reinforce more what you've just said. It takes a pioneer, it takes an executive with a vision that may not know exactly how this is going to play out. Sometimes, it's kind of weird the way they come up with the idea. It could be on a golf course or somewhere else, but they grab onto it. They herald that particular piece of technology, and the ones that don't succeed bring it back, pass it to the next level of management and say, make it happen. The ones that do succeed say, I want you to make it happen, and I'm joining the monthly committee, work group, steering committee to make sure it does happen. And in the instances of really great technology accomplishments in large global corporations, you see that that pioneer, that executive sponsor play an active role in the project throughout the life of the project. And it can be not weeks or months, but years. And so it would be my observation that Jamie Dimon, in this particular case, CEO of JP Morgan Chase, not only brought the idea to his team, but I know this, he's personally involved in how this whole thing rolls out. He was behind the big study that they did on the opportunities in the metaverse. And so when you got the number one guy or gal that's running the show, that's pushing the overall effort, what happens is it happens a lot more quickly. When there's roadblocks that get in the way, this executive pushes them out of the way so the initiative can continue. When there's a shortage of money, the executive might come up with the money. It's just an absolutely critical position. And I'll flip it around the other way, Tim. If you don't have that executive sponsor, and that's step number one in our 8-step methodology, if you don't have the executive sponsor, I'd strongly recommend you probably not dabble too much in the metaverse at this time.
Yeah, I think that that's such a critical step. And again, in the JP Morgan with Jamie Dimon position, he is obviously one of the brilliant minds in finance. And to get him on board early obviously took away a bunch of roadblocks. But what if you have a CEO who's basically says, what's this metaverse thing all about? Then he hands it to some other executive and says, go figure it out and then come back to me. How do you advise those kind of guys? Because one, they're probably out of their element, but number two, he's really doing, he's been given what I would consider a relatively impossible task without some kind of maybe outside support.
So, and very often that is the case, Tim. Okay. But let me tell you how I think that should be approached. So the most important thing is to keep the chief executive, the highest level possible, aware of what's happening inside the project, the value to the corporation. So continually feeding information up to the top to show them what's going on. Because at a certain point, the executive will pay attention. We just won this deal and took the business away from that company. And all of a sudden, the executive say, well, what is this thing you're talking about? So I'm of the belief that you drive the project still from the next level down. You have to. But that you understand clearly the vision of the executive that gave it to you, and you feed information back up to the executive on progress, on accomplishment, and over time, just like a fish on a hook, you're throwing the cast out far, but slowly you're bringing the executive in. And once you've landed him or her because you've really delivered something that they see as valuable, then they become a true executive sponsor. So it's not an optimal position. It happens probably in, 60, 70% of the cases. But the way to do it is to make sure you drive excellence and make sure you communicate that excellence back up to the top.
I think that the real key here, based on not only the JP Morgan example, but the case studies, as you said, were about 175 case studies from different industries, by the way, that show that these people, any of these companies are trying to be not only proactive, but using it as kind of a research exercise at the same time, but knowing full well that there's something there, right? And they can't sit back on the sideline. They've got to at least put some existing R&D budget towards this. And I know that in the discussions that we bring up with some of the executives, we're very clear on that these projects need to have not only the right visionary, but it's got to have the kind of funding necessarily to at least put together what we call pilot programs, right?
Yep. No, I totally agree. And I think, I thought about this too. Think about JP Morgan. This is a huge corporation. And they decided that we're going to learn, JP Morgan, are going to learn by creating the Onyx Lounge and getting involved in the various virtual gaming and virtual real estate. And we're doing that so that we can offer other institutions and businesses that are our customers a way into the metaverse where we can actually give them very good guidance and coaching to make sure they succeed within that environment. So what JP Morgan did so well, I think, is that they took the jump off the deep end in a very structured way, but with a clear understanding that they were using that experience to benefit their customers. And believe me, they have in mind that $1 trillion business economy that will come from their customers in the metaverse, but they were leading the way. And for that, I take my hat off and say, chapeau to the executive team at JP Morgan.
Well, we've pretty much run out of time for our particular podcast this week, but it is really interesting that the fact that there are incredible amount of companies already being successful. And our goal here in our podcast is every time we come to you, that we'll give you a new case study, delve into it, and share how people are using it today. And I cannot emphasize enough that the fact that this is already going on, even though there's a lot of confusion out there about whether even the metaverse should exist or whether there's even an opportunity. Believe me, you sit there waiting for this to happen, it's going to pass you by. And these companies are putting significant money into it for the exact reason, because they're willing to not only understanding that it has a potential future, but they're willing to bet on it. Well, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to being back with you in the next week or so. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.